It seems at the moment that the Battlefield 2042 information is coming thick and fast. Like every single day there's something new to talk about, which is great because whether it's, positive or negative, we're still discussing the game and we're only a couple of weeks away. So soon we're going to find out whether all this stuff really matters or not. But today it's a pretty contentious talking point. Some interesting news about the console versions of Battlefield 2042. At launch, there won't be support for a 120Hz mode on the new consoles. This is a feature that some games are starting to use thanks to the additional power inside these new consoles, as well as HDMI 2.1 supporting 120Hz all the way up to 4K resolution. DICE, at least for the time being, has decided not to include the feature in 2042, and we do have the reason why, thanks to a forum post from a DICE developer. According to them, right now the team is already hammering the CPUs of the new consoles with 128 player support, and the jump from 60 FPS to 120 FPS is not trivial. Reducing the resolution of the game, say down to 1080p from 4K, apparently that's not going to help that much either, according to the developer. So it seems for the launch of the game on the new consoles, DICE is aiming to provide a solid 60 FPS experience. That's what they hit on the last generation with their previous games. Now personally, as soon as I saw DICE was pushing to 128 players from the previous 64 players that Battlefield used to have on their previous games, once we saw that revealed back in June, I pretty much wrote off 120Hz support for the new consoles. Other games like Call of Duty Vanguard and Halo, those are supporting 120Hz, I believe, but I'm going to say it right now, those games have far less players running around, smaller environments, and are generally less taxing on the new consoles. I'm not saying that they're not utilizing the power in those games, but if you compare 6v6 Vanguard to 64 versus 64 Battlefield 2042, I think it's clear there's a massive difference between these two games. And with the information that dropping the resolution or even potentially reducing graphical fidelity of the experience is unlikely to yield the result of a smooth 120 FPS experience, I'm not going to hold out much hope of seeing 120Hz support come to Battlefield 2042, at least in the near future. If it is a CPU load issue, using all of the available power to make sure the game runs smoothly with 128 players at 60 FPS, then it's very unlikely the DICE team is going to be able to do much beyond what they already have. They're limited by the physical CPU. There's not much more they can do. The team has essentially built a game, even at this early stage of the new console lifecycle, that has maxed out the available power of the systems, which when you consider the scale that Battlefield 2042 is actually going for, that's hardly surprising. I will say that it is certainly disappointing to hear that 120Hz support won't be available for 2042 on those new consoles, but it is also worth remembering that a feature like 120Hz support is only likely to be activated, at least at the moment, by quite a small portion of the console player base anyway. 120Hz capable TVs, they're still just starting to creep into the mainstream market. I actually have one. I've got an LG CX, and it is absolutely awesome. Honestly, it's incredible, but most games releasing for these new consoles are still being targeted for 4K resolution at 60 FPS. Because the adoption of displays that can support the higher frame rate with a higher refresh rate, that adoption is going to take a while to really kick in. Plus, for the next few years, most developers are still going to be trying to work out how they can get the most performance out of this new hardware. I know the consoles have been out for nearly a year already, but that's probably not enough time for these games to really hone in and sort of do some magical trickery to try and get more performance out of them. You sort of see that towards the end of a console generation, so I wouldn't be surprised if it's a few more years before we start to see games that are releasing at 120 FPS, or are targeted at that instead of being targeted at 60 FPS. And there's a really good example here. Also, if you bought a brand new TV just before the 120Hz models start hitting the market, well then you're not likely to spend the same amount of money again on another TV that's probably going to cost north of like $1,500. In a few years' time, I've got no doubt that a lot more people on the console side of things, they will have TVs capable of higher refresh rates in their setups, but right now that number is still going to be quite small. On the PC side of things, high refresh rate support has been around for years now, And also, having more processing power available in general means that the game will be running at a higher frame rate over on the PC side. The trade-off here is that PC gaming generally costs quite a lot more to get yourself set up. The PC itself, the one that you're going to want to hit those consistently high frame rates, at the moment, with the global shortages that are happening, it's going to cost you like 4 or 5 times the cost of one of those new consoles. And then there's the cost of the high refresh rate monitor, so you can actually see those extra frames. Then there's all the peripherals to go on top of it. It starts to add up. So for a fraction of the cost, you can pick up a PlayStation 5 or an Xbox Series X or S, and you can play Battlefield 2042 with 128 players, All-Out Warfare, Portal, and Hazard Zone on day one at a frame rate that you've already been playing games at for over 10 years now, 60 FPS. And that was never a problem until 120 FPS started to be mentioned. I think 60 FPS is still like the sweet spot for most gaming scenarios right now anyway, unless you're playing like ultra competitive games over on PC where having as many frames as possible is optimal. But over the next few years, I do think we'll see a slow shift over to a target of 120 FPS, a bit like with smartphones really. For years, people were quite content with their 60Hz displays displaying 60 FPS content, and that was until the capability to display things at a higher frame rate emerged, and so 120Hz or even 90Hz panels started to be fitted into certain phones. Now, you've got both the Samsung and Apple top-tier flagships running with high refresh rate panels. And over the next few years, more and more phones are going to start to shift into that permanent 120Hz territory, and the adoption will massively ramp up. If you then looked at a 60Hz display after using a 120Hz display on a phone, you'll know what I mean. It's hard to go back. So the same is going to happen for consoles. Right now, most people are happy with 60 FPS, but over time, over the next few years, 120 FPS is going to bleed in, and it's going to ramp up. And 120 FPS will become the standard. We're just not quite there yet. Now, one other mention in the forums by the same developer, they were talking about some changes to the overall presentation of different factions in Battlefield 2042. During the beta, there was a lot of feedback about how it was hard to differentiate between factions because specialists are not locked to one or the other. You're free to choose whichever specialist you want to play as, and that meant the same soldier profiles being seen on both sides of the fight. So we had like McKay fighting McKay wearing the exact same uniform. Bit mental. It seems as though since then, DICE have made some changes, or may have made some changes, introducing some slight colour tinting to enemy soldiers. They'll now have a slightly darker, reddish tint to them overall, and that's supposed to give you the visual identifier that those are people that you should be firing your bullets at. Now, it's going to be interesting to see how much of a difference this will really make when launch comes around in a couple of weeks' time, and players do start to unlock a bunch of specialist skins, so all the specialists won't be wearing the same outfit, they'll be wearing different ones, because that can either complicate the issue even further, or it could solve the issue if the tinting is strong enough to be able to change the skin visually. So time is going to tell on this one, but it's nice to hear that the feedback of all the specialists look the same has been heard by DICE, and they're trying to make some changes. So overall, yes, it is disappointing to see that 120Hz support is not coming to Battlefield 2042, at least at launch, but I do think when you just look a little bit deeper, it becomes extremely obvious as to why that has not been implemented. And if you were expecting 120Hz support for the new Battlefield game that has 128 players, has maps bigger than ever before, and it's just going above and beyond on the graphical side, well, I would argue that maybe you put out your expectations a little bit too far. It is disappointing, of course, because you are seeing some games go up to that level, but as soon as I heard we were going to 128 players and the maps were going to get bigger, like I said, I pretty much threw away the idea of 120Hz support. As for the soldier tinting, it does give me vibes of the Battlefield 5 rim lighting issues that we had a couple of years ago, where we've got this small fix being implemented that may or may not be enough to solve the entire problem. So just have to wait and see, I guess. But today, thank you very much for watching. Once again, just keeping you up to date with everything to do with Battlefield 2042. And make sure you subscribe, because there will be more stuff coming out over the next few days, no doubt, as we get closer and closer to launch and we learn even more about this game. So yeah, subscribe for more, and I'll catch you in the next one.